right, so this is the For Freedom's Sake video podcast, and this is an interesting one for me, viewers and listeners, because I have the honor of having one of my good friends on the show today. He is Kevin Sunday. He is the Director of Government Affairs for the Pennsylvania Chamber of Commerce. Kevin has a wealth of knowledge. He has experience with energy, serving under the state EPA. And then before that, correct me if I'm wrong, Kevin, you've been for a young man, you've been involved with Pennsylvania politics for a pretty long time. Before your tenure at the EPA, you worked on Governor Tom Corbett's successful governor's run.
That's right. Yeah, about 10 years ago, I was splitting my time between volunteering on the campaign and waiting tables in another state. And came on with a paid position during transition and then worked at DEP. And in that first year, I also chaired a judicial race in York County for Judge Trebilcock, who won the primary and then in the general. And that was an honor to see him get on the bench. Craig's a great guy, and he's done a lot of work to improve the treatment of veterans as they go through the court system.
Yeah. So, like I said, it's unique because you were in my wedding, I was in yours. We're good friends, so to have like a professional podcast here is a little bit odd, but it's fun at the same time. And when I look across the Commonwealth at young people that have a pulse on Pennsylvania politics, you're at the top of the list. So, friendship aside, it's an honor to have you on the For Freedom's Sake cast.
Yeah, thank you, and it's an honor to be here.
Yeah. So, let's get started. I have some challenging questions for you, and I know that as the thoughtful guy you are, you'll have some good answers. So, the first question is an economic one, and your answer, I'm sure, will be more balanced than some of the other answers I've gotten. I remember when I posed this question to Matt Bellis of Reopen PA, he was very adamant in one way. But the question is this. So we've been in this pandemic. Pennsylvania, like other states, and in some ways it's been worse here, has had to deal with just the balance of public health, but also the health of the economy. So as we head into, let's see, we're heading into the fifth month here. Of course, there's risks with every type of angle that you handle something like a pandemic, but to date, and maybe even looking into the future, is the economic risk of shutdown and overreach and restriction, does that maybe even outweigh, at least from what we know of the coronavirus, the health measures?
Yeah, it's a little bit tricky to separate the two, because a lot of the economic reduction that has happened was voluntary up to a certain point. That if you examine some of the traffic patterns and telecommuting, that people started staying home really before the governor made his call. So it's not clear that every reduction in GDP and job loss that we've seen has come from the governor's shutdown order. That being said, Pennsylvania is, I believe, among the top 5 states in total unemployment claims. We're way up there in terms of the unemployment rate. And that's really troubling to me personally, and then me professionally. There's pretty well established academic literature that shows for every 1 point increase in the unemployment rate, there's a corresponding 1% increase in the incidence of suicide and drug overdose. And that's actually borne out fairly well in some rural counties of Pennsylvania, at least in the first few months of the pandemic. More people died by those means than of the virus. Now, that's certainly not the case in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, where unfortunately the mortality is in the low thousands. But all that being said as well, we're really not going to see a full economic recovery until we get a really good handle on treatment and potentially a vaccine. While the governor's had there's certainly criticism that can be leveled at the governor. I think early on people gave him a break in an emergency. You want to see action on the part of your leaders over time. There's a question of has that gone too far? Most recently, the order that restaurants that operate can only operate 25% capacity across the state. That's going to put almost every restaurant under if that continues. And the fact that there's a lot of frustration on the part of retail establishments that they have to enforce a mask mandate, putting a younger worker, say a 20-year-old female at the door, and tell her she's got to tell everyone that comes in the door to wear a mask. We've seen assaults, we've seen police called, we've seen people put in really scary situations over enforcing an order that that is the governor's directive.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know to speak to just the other health casualties around this, not even necessarily economic, like you mentioned, suicides, and even drug overdoses. Midway through this pandemic, Kristen Phillips Hill brought to my attention actually that there was a 300% increase in York County of heroin overdoses. So there's other effects even in the realm of health that you're going to have to wade through in a pandemic like this that I don't want our lawmakers to shortchange. But politics in this season, I mean, we've had 5 months. A lot more time potentially to sit on our phones, scroll through Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and there are, Kevin, opinions aplenty. And we talk about this occasionally. I know me personally, I've had to just because I've noticed that it wasn't producing any fruit in my life, step back from that. And I still am informed. I like to be informed, but I've had to take a step back. And my question for you is, particularly the Christian who wants to avoid like this divisiveness. They want to stay informed, but they want to kind of steer clear of this argumentative thing that's rearing its head in America. And of course, they don't want to be apathetic while avoiding it. So what would your advice be to those people who want to be civically engaged to a degree, but they just want to hightail it out of these arguments and social media posts and what have you?
Yeah, I think there's a lot there that could be said for that. When I hear apathy, I'm reminded of the REM song, What's the Frequency, Kenneth? When Michael Stipe sang, withdrawal and disgust is not the same as apathy. Paul, maybe we should quote scripture too. Paul in Thessalonians talks about not being busybodies. And I think there's a lot of what happens in social media is this feeling that I need to police and have an opinion on everything that's out there. And so much of what is called news isn't really an event, but a pseudo event that is more signaling outrage and what groups of people have status in society versus an actual event that has meaning in your life. I mean, I think one test of whether you're engaging with news and social media too much is to just ask yourself, after you read the morning news, wherever you get it, is there anything in there that actually changed how you're going to go about your day? Or did it give you any information on problems you're going to solve? And then if you look at your habits on social media and you find yourself wondering, is this really stirring up my affections for Jesus? Is this making it harder for me to love other people? Then maybe it's time to step back. Maybe one of the healthiest things that you could do is what our pastor at my church in Mechanicsburg challenged us to do last September was for 21 days, deactivate your Facebook and Twitter, take it off your phone, off your computer, put in a web block if you need to. And any time that you felt the urge to check social media, read a chapter of John. So just work, through the whole book and just read the same chapter a day and just really meditate on what God has done and who we are as adopted sons of the King, and be focused and so rooted on that. And then at the end of those several weeks, look, check back into the news and did you really miss on anything? Because I would gather that almost nothing that is going to come up in the news really has much bearing on your day-to-day life. We're called as Christians to be convicted in the truth, but we're also called to be compassionate. And I think it's very clear that in Scripture, the way that God wins is through weakness and the laying down of his life on the cross. And that is a very different winning than what the world thinks of as winning. So when we are engaging in politics, I think it's just imperative that we not lose the sense of compassion for the people that we're engaging with, that even if they are coming at subject matters and opinions from a very different place than ours, they still bear the image of God. They're still created. They still are worthy of dignity. And it's okay on any number of issues to say, I really don't have an opinion on that. I really don't know. And that's okay. It's okay. You don't, as Gandalf says in Lord of the Rings, it's not us to be master of all tides. It's us to tend the garden that's in front of us, and that's your community and your family. And the more we tend to the local matters, I think the less we need to look to Harrisburg or Washington for a solution.
Yeah. And the desire to be right, I think for a lot of Christians in this season has replaced the desire to be Christ-like. Humility doesn't require being right or winning an argument. It requires loving the person, as you have a discussion. Not Adam, Brian recently posed the question, in the height of all of this, and the little tangent that we were dealing with at our church was the mask mandate, and there were opinions swirling about that, and he simply posed the question, would you wash the feet of your enemies? Would you superimpose anyone in there? Would you wash Tom Wolfe's feet? And it kind of made our congregation think, and I think it's a valid question right now, because I think humility, a posture of humility wins. It's not the master of the argument or even rhetoric.
It's a challenge, right? I mean, Paul writes in Romans about submitting to governing authorities and praying for those in power whom God has instituted in 2 Timothy. And it's really hard for us when we see leaders taking actions that we don't agree with to wrestle out a theology of what we're supposed to do with that. When is disobedience proper and when is it non-biblical? And that's something that Christians of all different denominations have wrestled with for a long time. I think what's really challenging with Scripture is it talks a lot about kings, and we don't have kings in this country. We have democracy where we do have leaders, but they're in power because we vote for them. So we at the same time are ruled and rulers. And there's been this tension, and it continues to this day of, to what extent does faith inform the conduct of believers, voters, and leaders? And it's something that I think takes a lot of thought. It takes wisdom on the part of pastors to inform their congregations. Just what is a healthy level of engagement with politics in the public sphere, and what isn't?
Yeah, and we've been actually blessed in our Commonwealth where there have not really been, no matter what people have heard, strict provisions on churches not to meet or not to sing, or you're seeing a different story if you head over to the state of California. I was talking to friends just the other week where there's even something on the table or some variation of a limit in like meeting at your home to have a Bible study, and it's just California's a little bit of a different situation than Pennsylvania, but we still have those freedoms here, and I think it's off balance to like compare us to like a China and say, see, we're being persecuted, because they really aren't comparable.
No, not in the least. If you read some of the declarations of faith from the Chinese pastors, there's one that circulated among the Presbyterian group over there last year, where the pastor basically said, the worst thing anyone could ever do is to not let someone hear the faith of Christ. And then at the same time, he was telling the communists in power, I still love you and will pray for your conversion, because that's the greatest gift that you could ever have. And you see that level of conviction from the church in China. And then I compare it to some of the really, rending of garments and gnashing of teeth among the evangelical church in America, which I think really has polluted its witness. And one way that I think that's borne out, and it really troubles me, is according to one poll, over the last 8 years, evangelicals, self-described evangelicals, went from the subgroup of voters who were most likely to say a person who commits an immoral act in his personal life is qualified to govern. They're now the most permissive group of voters to say that's all right as long as we get what we want. I think that's really troubling, and maybe something that bears some repentance on the part of the individual in the church.
Yeah, that's an interesting trend. So I want to follow up with an economic question. You had covered this a bit in the beginning, but so you have as much as anyone probably, in the Commonwealth, just a pulse for where business owners are. I know you had talked about the food business, the restaurant business, and we know that there's such a slim margin, in that business where restrictions like this could literally bury you, with the COVID situation in Pennsylvania. But what's the pulse from across the state? Perhaps you've gotten poll data from business owners of all types. What's the sentiment with getting back rolling, getting back to work, hiring new people, getting back to normal?
Yeah, it really depends on sectors. I mean, the giant Amazon, FedExes of the world, they're hiring like crazy. Restaurants, tourism, retail, they're really hurting. Those Main Street type businesses are really in the doldrums. Airline travel's way down. People aren't commuting as much. So I work in the energy space. So the refiners, the wholesalers of gasoline are hurting. Electricity use is down. So power plants are kind of on the margin. They're really hurting. So you might see some more retirements in rural areas that use coal in the next couple of years. I think it's going to be sort of a wave of sector by sector, depending on how this all plays out. If first you lose some marginal business in energy and retail and tourism, well, then what does that do for the banks that were invested in there? And then what does that do with their ability to lend to somebody that wants to start a new business? There's a lot that this is going to play out in a lot of different ways that we're not sure how it's going to go. I think a lot of it depends on what Congress does next. A lot of the aid that they had passed back in April is going to expire August 1. And depending on where the Democratic Congress or Republican Senate land in the next couple of weeks, we could be in for a lot more economic pain, or things could be somewhat alleviated. But I think we're in a kind of the phase 2 of this virus right now, where we're talking about reopening, but some of the federal aid, particularly unemployment, where there was not only did you get your money, but you got $600 extra. So some people were making more on unemployment than they were when they were working. That's about to go away. And when that happens, what does that mean for landlords, the utility companies, everyone that gets paid a monthly bill that folks might not be able to? It really could have a lot of economic pain in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah. So as we look ahead to an election here in November, and then of course in 2022 we'll be electing a new governor. There's been a lot of criticism, with our governor, how he's handled things, and we don't need to get into the specifics of that. It's been, some people have called him tyrannical. Some people agree. Of course, there's the spectrum. But one thing is for sure. It's been a polarizing moment for the governor's office, and there's seemingly like this grassroots movement, call it Reopen PA, call it whatever you like, where even most recently, you have bills being passed by both chambers unanimously, and then he is seemingly on an island just ready to strike it down. To what degree do you think this year, as Pennsylvanians head to the poll, will it be a referendum on his conduct?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Pennsylvanians have, more than a lot of other states, shown an ability to split their ticket. They don't do a lot of just vote for one party or the other. So it's not uncommon for a Republican to win a Senate race in Pennsylvania the same year the state goes Democratic for president. and then the congressional races are split all over the place. That being said, we're trending more towards single party voting. And so when you look at Wolf's performance, Democrats think he's doing a good job, Republicans don't, independents are split. It's the reverse for Trump. Democrats don't think Trump's doing a good job, Republicans do. That being said, the governor he got good marks early on from the public. He was pushing 70% approval. That's eroded. He's now in the upper 40s. It's a pretty substantial fall off, and that's before some of the recent actions he's taken. When it's hard to say what's going to be on people's minds when they go in November, and it might even be a matter of, can you go to the polls in November? Or is this going to be a mail-in election? That's a point of contention right now. And what does that mean for turnout? I mean, this could be the first time in literally 100 years where we're doing a mail-in general election. We might not wake up the day after the election and know who won the presidency in the country. It might be a number of weeks till the absentee ballots come in. 2022, hard to say. I mean, if Biden wins this fall and the economy slugs along, it's time to pick a new governor in 2022. Voters could very well say, I think it's time to go back to a Republican for governor, particularly if that candidate's talking about jobs and getting people back to work. There are more Democrats than Republicans in Pennsylvania, but that hasn't helped. That hasn't stopped Republicans from winning statewide before. And generally, folks seem to vote governor counter to the party that's in the White House. That's been the long-term trend. But a lot can change in 2 years' time. I mean, my goodness, in 2008, in the middle of the Great Recession and everything that was going on in Iraq, George Bush's approval ratings were way down. Obama swept into office, had the House and Senate. They thought they were going to change the world. And 2 years later, the Tea Party came in and won back the House and the Senate. So these things can change very, very quickly. Some of it depends on the economy. Some of it depends on how far the folks in power try to go with some of their policies.
Yeah. Any educated guesses of our governor that takes office in 2022 for either party?
In terms of who I think wins?
Yeah, who might run and who could possibly win?
Yeah, I think on the Democratic side, it's pretty well established. Josh Shapiro, our current Attorney General, is eyeing the governor's race. He takes a number of highly public stands in litigation against the Trump administration and enforcement action against the Catholic Church or the energy industry, really trying to make a name for himself that way. On the Republican side, there's a number of candidates out there that might run. I think current Senator Pat Toomey is probably at the top of that list. I think he's maybe the best option. He's won statewide before. He's got a good knowledge of the state. He's conservative to the core, but knows how to talk to suburban voters. He has a very different temperament than the current president, which might serve him well in a couple years. So I think those are your probably your two leading ones, Shapiro versus Toomey. There's some U.S. House members out there that might look at it. There's a couple folks in the state Senate. It is really hard to jump and win statewide in Pennsylvania from a congressional or state Senate seat. It's just people just don't know who you are outside of your district.
Yeah, but there's been rumors, and he's actually going to be a guest on my program potentially next week. Senator Doug Mastriano. He's kind of risen in the ranks of popularity thanks to his, number one, the Reopen PA Facebook group, but also his nightly Facebook Live fireside chats, and he's kind of the unofficial head of this, whatever you want to call it, freedom, let's just say caucus. And he leads some of these rallies at the Capitol, like there was one yesterday. What do you say about his chances? I mean, he's certainly not moderate, and to win the governor's race in Pennsylvania, one would think that you have to show a little bit of moderation. But what about someone like Senator Doug Mastriano's chances?
Yeah, I mean, in the short time he's been in the state Senate, he's shown a lot of command of the issues. He's very well prepared. He has a military background. He was a planner for some of the operations in the Middle East. So he certainly understands, you take the intelligence on the ground and shape a strategy around it. Pennsylvania's a hard state to win. It'll be interesting to see as folks line up. Can he get some of the institutional and local support you need to get through the primary? I certainly wouldn't count them out.
Yeah. So let's switch gears here to just the realm of faith and the gospel. For me, working at a church and being around, Adam and Brian and others, it's much different for me to implement my faith in my work environment than it would be for most others. You work in politics and business. We have a lot of teachers in our congregation, and there's a host of vocations, but what role should faith play in your work environment, in politics, namely, and in our families?
Yeah, it's a good question, and maybe the right question is, what role does your environment and politics and work and families play in your faith? I mean, faith is central to our existence. I hearken back to the theologian J.I. Packer, who passed away last Friday, and at the core of his writings was the proposition that adoption to sonship is the highest privilege in all of Scripture. That we are sons and daughters of the Most High King is an even better gift than having our slate wiped clean through the cross, or knowing that maybe we go to heaven someday, but we're actually beloved children of God. And when that is what we look at and identify with first and foremost, everything else is subordinate to that. Then you walk through some of Paul's writings, and it's very clear what he says is the mark of maturity for a Christian believer is love. It's not knowledge or wisdom or the display or use of gifts, though all those are really good things and things we should earnestly desire, but love, a love that hopes all things, believes all things, endures all things. So I think the most important thing for me, and I speak to myself here too, but for all of us, is to just remain rooted in our station of life as loved sons and daughters of God. And then out of that, how that plays out, well, now I can look at work and say, I have gifts, but I don't need to change the world because, God's overcome the world. I have gifts that I can serve. I have the ability to, decipher complex matter and help explain it to businesses so they can understand what they need to do to operate efficiently and stay in good graces of government. I have negotiation skills, so when regulators are looking to do something that might hurt business, I can convene a group and we can talk things through from shared goals and principles and come to a good resolution. I don't need to win all the time because I can trust that ultimately God wins. Ultimately, every knee shall bow. So I can look at politics and say, what, whoever wins, I'm going to be okay. We're going to be okay. There might be times of trouble or persecution, but I know that God has provided for me. For my family, I don't need to have perfect children or the perfect spouse, but I can love them and steward them and guide them in the way they should go and lay my life down for them. I think one of the things that's interesting, one of the big conversations around this pandemic is the fall and schools reopening, and I get this sense sometimes that people are freaked out with the notion that they should have to educate and care for their own children. And now I understand I'm coming out from someone who's the father of a 1.5-year-old where he's home all the time. But I think it's really strange that it seems to me, again, my general impression, not universal, but a lot of Christians have really gotten used to dumping their kids into daycare or school and expected someone else to raise them. And in the middle of this pandemic where those aren't options anymore, I think a lot of folks have looked at their children and maybe they realize they don't know, who are these people? And maybe that requires some reflection and repentance. It is one of those things long-term where I wonder, do we totally rethink the way that we educate kids? Does the homeschooling option come back together? Do we do some cyber school for certain subject matters, and then others, Christians get together and they homeschool their kids jointly, and the public school model sort of starts to fall apart a little bit. Again, I don't know. I don't have strong feelings on education policy one way or the other, but I do think in terms of faith and family, if in the middle of this pandemic, you're finding yourself looking at children as just a burden and you can't wait for public schools to alleviate that, I wonder what's going on there.
Yeah, and that could be a blessing in disguise. I mean, homeschooling has certainly become a popular topic, in our community, and yeah, it does kind of break with the habit of just expecting, for a majority of households, the state to educate, and in a lot of ways, when kids are at school for that long, yes, they're being educated, but to a degree they're being raised. So that's an excellent point. So speaking culturally, Kevin, I mean, we've talked we talk pretty continually about things in politics and culture, and there's definitely something happening in our country. There's a lot of chaos. There's headlines that make you think, that sometimes are even designed to pull out a bit of anger in you. There's a thing called cancel culture, where not only are you under indictment for things that you may have said yesterday or 30 years ago, you're now being indicted for things that you may not say. So it's just an interesting time, and to kind of compare it to two things. I've heard two comparisons about this time with other times in our nation's history. There, of course, was the 1960s, which was the sexual revolution, and the Vietnam War. A lot of things were happening there. So older Americans were just looking in awe, like what is happening. Our nation is fundamentally transforming. And then there's when you look at just class warfare and political divisiveness. I look at the decade leading up to the Civil War, where there was this brewing conflict, and which ultimately led to the Civil War. But I make those comparisons just to shine some light on the situation that we're in, whether they're valid or not. My question to you is, culturally, can you put your finger on what exactly is happening, what the roots are to the moment that we find ourselves in right now?
Yeah, I think there's a lot going on, and just weeding through this one question we could talk for it at hours. I think there's a couple trends. The first is, with the advent of social media, we've gotten a good hard look at the elites who run our institutions: journalists, politicians, business leaders, and a lot of folks have realized I don't like what I see. And every 2 years, for basically the last, this social media era, which I think YouTube came along in 2006, Facebook caught on when we were in college around the same time. Basically, since that time, Congress has flipped every session or every other session, every 2 or 4 years. Presidents have gotten reelected, but by the skin of their teeth. And it just seems to be that voters say, I don't like what I'm seeing, give me the other guys. And then we swing back and forth. And that's I think in part because the political parties have gotten really weak. Some of that's from the way campaign finance laws unfolded. The health of the democracy structure that our Constitution laid out really relies on, paradoxically, an anti-democratic institutions: the community, the family, the local association, the churches. These are, I say anti-democratic because these are places where there is authority that Christians and conservatives recognize. The heads of these institutions, shape the direction. Now, folks get a voice. My family, my wife, and to an extent my kids get a voice, but we don't put everything up to a vote. And the rampant individualism, I think, has eroded that. And it's trickled up to the political parties who are no longer really allowed to kind of ameliorate some of the major cultural issues before legislation happens. In fact, Congress is now so dysfunctional, very little actual legislation happens, and it plays out in the courts. So a lot of folks feel like whatever the court's decision is, they didn't have a role in that decision, and they don't like the result, whatever the result is. And that's a shame. But what's also interesting on the courts is both sides feel like they're losing. I mean, if you look at the trends in the last couple of years, what's very clear is that the court has time and again, 15 straight cases, sided on the side of religious liberty, but they've also expanded gay rights. They've expanded the reach of the Second Amendment on guns. And they've kind of been all over the place on abortion law. They haven't touched Roe versus Wade, but at the same time, culturally, there's fewer and fewer abortions and divorces and children born out of wedlock. And I think that's, to the pro-life movement's credit, where they've had a legal strategy, but they haven't just stopped there, and they've talked about the importance of marriage and raising children within marriage, and that seems to be bearing some fruit. And it maybe is not getting as recognized as it should be. The same point on the religious liberty cases in the Supreme Court. But there is, both of those things being said, I think there's also a couple other dynamics. One is, we've been polarized before. This isn't the first time this has happened. We've had partisan press before. Pretty much all the magazines and newspapers in the early 1800s were partisan. That was one of the rewards of the spoil system. If your newspaper supported the right candidates, you might get a publishing contract for the laws and regulations that came out of Congress. So this idea that the media is fair and balanced is a fairly modern. It's almost a parenthetical to the history of news in this country. So we've gotten through it before. But we're really, the other thing is, we're really self-sorted. So we tend to live in places where a lot of people think like us. So when culture or there's a court case or a law passes that we don't agree with, we think like, well, who could even vote for somebody that thinks like that? Because we don't know anybody that thinks like that. And as an example of that, one of the most astounding political statistics I've heard in a long time. 1988, George Herbert Walker Bush, who's Reagan's vice president, runs for president, and he destroys Michael Dukakis. It's one of the biggest landslide wins ever in the history of the race for president. And yet, Dukakis won more counties in 1988 than Obama did in 2008 when he won for presidency. There's more people living in more rural areas, or there's less people living in rural areas, more in the urban areas, and that's created some really interesting dynamics on the electoral college map. And I think that the final element to all this is there definitely is a spiritual element underneath all of this. For a long time, through the history of our country, there's been this sense that you need to have faith or democracy doesn't work. John Adams talked about it. Dwight Eisenhower talked about it. He said, this country makes no sense unless you have faith in God, whatever it is, right? He sort of said, it doesn't matter what you really think of God as long as you think of him sometimes. In the 50s to maybe say the 70s, the prevailing strain of Christianity that informed our elites was mainline Protestantism. This is, your Methodists, your Lutherans, your churches that at that time, I think it's fair to say, kind of de-emphasized some of the theological claims of the Bible and elevated some of the social claims. And that wasn't really new to the time. The social gospel movement in the late 19th century that informed women's rights, labor, and temperance movements, and that carries through the progressive movement today. The mainline denominations focused on worldly matters, maybe at the expense of spiritual matters. So much so that over time, some of those churches say, well, was Jesus really God? I don't know, but we gotta help the poor or refugees or whatever. I think, and this is an interesting observation that some writers like Ross Douthat at the New York Times and Joseph Bottoms, who used to be at the Weekly Standard, made was, we're living through what might be called a post-Protestant Reformation, which is the elites, the educated folks who used to be informed by mainline Protestant churches still carry with that sense that there is a need to repent and confess and confront original sin. This is what you see at the dynamic when folks gather and kneel and confess white privilege and confess to African Americans how they might have in some way contributed to their plight in life, but yet they've cast aside the metaphysics of Christianity in which Christ died and reconciled us to God. They still have this original sin sense that America is fundamentally racist and corrupt to the core. But there's no hope for forgiveness short of tearing the whole structure down. Now, I think that's still very much a minority view. I still can't quite tell if a lot of the agitation we see is real or if it's just virtual and sort of a bit of play acting that and of course I think the devil's more than happy to whip fear up inside of us. I don't know that it comes to civil war. I do know that I am intrigued by this proposition of turnings in American history, that it seems to be about every 80 years we suffer cataclysm and then come out of it. So we might think of the revolutionary period of the Constitution, that 15 years as a cataclysm in which there was a war, and out of that was the birth of a new country. 80 years after that, we're in 1850s and 60s, where we have bloody skirmishes in Kansas and across the country over slavery and what that means, leading to the Civil War. 80 years after that, we're in the Great Depression and World War II, but we come out of that with the greatest economic boom in the history of the world. And then we shuffle into the Civil Rights Movement, and now 80 years removed from those events, we seem to be in the middle of something big again. What comes out of it, I think, remains to be seen. But it really, I think it is a somewhat troubling time, but I'm not sure how much, I don't know how much it really carries the day outside of certain urban centers, that I don't think a lot of people are on board with some of the messaging that's coming out of some of these groups.
Yeah. What it looks like this season that we're in, and this is a good thing, is you look back into history, and you have the first Great Awakening, if I have my years right, 17
20s and 30s,
30s, 40s, and then you have a second move of God. In preceding the Civil War years, you've got another one then at the turn of the 20th century, and then you have another one here in the 70s that was coined the Jesus movement. And what's interesting about each of those moves of God, especially the first three, was you had this level of atrophy and religiousness in the church, and it was like this period of time went on. The church became more atrophied and more pharisaical, and in some cases, like the first Great Awakening, one of the physical events that sparked that in New England was the strangest of earthquakes near Boston. I look back at the Azusa Street revival in California at the turn of the 20th century, and you had a huge earthquake in San Francisco that actually killed a lot of people. But to be an optimist, Kevin, I look at this season and think, yeah, it looks bad if you're skimming headlines, and maybe it is pretty bad. You got a lot of chaos and division, but the good news is maybe we're primed for another movement. Maybe one of the shifting plates that's happening right now is God is preparing His bride. He's preparing His remnant, and there's going to be another move of God.
It could be. I mean, I think and again, I'm guilty of this too. If I'm more concerned about what the governor of California said or the dumb thing the governor of New York said the other day, and not what's going on in my own family or my neighbor down the street, right? If I know more about what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted the other day, and not the needs of not only my neighbor, but my neighbor's neighbor, so two houses down, do I even know their names and what's going on in their lives? I think something's wrong there, right? We're called to tend our own gardens and work to the kingdom at hand, the kingdom with the people that God puts in front of us, right? It's the whole, who is my neighbor? It's who you come across of in need. And I don't know what my neighbor's needs are if I don't know that. I hearken back to when John the Baptist gives this great theological prophecy of what's occurring, right? Make straight the path in the wilderness, a voice crying out. And it's this really lofty theological claim that, the high will be brought low and everything. And there's this crowd listening. They're really interested. And then they say, like a lot of type A folks like me say, what do we do? What do we do? I appreciate the deep theological discussion we're having here. I'm really interested. What do I do? And John says, bear fruit in keeping with repentance. So there's sin in my life I need to lay before God. And then there's different groups of people in the crowd who he, based on their individual circumstance, tells them to do certain things. So for the people who have 2 cloaks, he said, give to whoever has none 1. So I need, and whatever God given me, I need to be generous. But I need to know who needs a cloak, right? I need to know people, right? I don't need to just pay my taxes and hope government's going to take care of somebody. I need to, where are the needs in my community to meet them? And he says to the tax collectors who are, skimming off the top, to put that away, right? To behave professionally, to use your gifts and administrative on behalf of the government in a good way. He doesn't say don't work for the government anymore. He just says be fair. And then for the soldiers, again, an instrument of Roman rule, he doesn't say leave that sphere of life. He says be content with your wages, right? Be happy with what you have. And I think, taking a look at those 3 responses and wondering where do I fit in those, and it's probably the answer is probably some in all of them. I think revival definitely starts with repentance, and something that I think we all need to take a hard look at.
Yeah.
So I do think there's a revival happening with some of these mass protests. It's definitely a mass movement. There's definitely a sense of, like I said, original sin, that there's these strange power dynamics as these folks are perceiving that they want to uproot. I think they're maybe looking or being sent down the wrong rabbit hole. But when folks do start talking about wanting government to operate better and to treat people better, I mean, I do think that's a role the church should be speaking to. Maybe not on the terms and with the remedies some of these groups call for. But I wouldn't want to abandon the field to these folks.
Yeah, that's a good point. So one final question for you. It's a question that I get a lot. And opinions and preferences aside, there's always this question, especially in the volatile time that we're in. Where do you get your news? Which news source is impartial? And I don't know really that any of them are, but where would you point someone who in a very pure way is saying, Joe and Kevin, I just want the facts. I want as little biases as possible. Where would you point me?
Yeah. I might say, I might be tempted to say you better just ignoring almost all of it, because it's really not going to help. Is it really informing you, or is it a place to be idle or slander your neighbor or gossip or be a busybody or a meddlesomeness? These are all sins laid out in the Bible that, again, I think an overly interested being in news media might lend you towards. In some ways, reading books about Dostoevsky's Russian literature, the biographies of Lincoln Grant and Frederick Douglass, those in a weird way can be more relevant than anything you'll read in the newspaper. I was reading a book last night by G.K. Chesterton, a Catholic writer from 100 years ago, about anarchists. There's an ascendant anarchist movement in the United States and Europe. And he made this point about if poor people rebel, they'll rebel because they want good government. If the educated rebel, they might be anarchists and they want to, deploy power in support of chaos. And somehow that rhymes with today, where a lot of the folks that are supportive of these really radical, progressive elements are not poor folks. They're from upper middle class backgrounds and went to Ivy League schools. And I thought, well, that's really sounds like today. All that being said, and with the caveat that, again, a lot of it is probably just junk food and empty calories. And then we need to be rooted in love and truth. I think, you could do worse than looking at just a few examples. Anything Russell Moore writes out of the Southern Baptist Convention is good. The National Review is a good conservative news outlet. Again, they have their biases, but they're going to have a good take on things. Steve Hayes, who used to run the Weekly Standard, has an operation called The Dispatch that has some good information. The Wall Street Journal is good on economic news.
Yeah.
And then there are some good writers on social media. Robert George, who's a professor at Princeton, usually has a good take on current events. The folks at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in DC usually have a good faith and informed view of what's going on. And there's, I'm sure if I think further, there's some more that I could walk through, but I think the question just kind of has to come back to, do we want to know what's going on because we want to make an informed choice at the ballot this fall? And by the way, there's more to civic life than just voting, right? There's keeping in touch with your elected representatives throughout the year with letters and phone calls. There's supporting your local community associations. There's being invested in your neighborhood. I mean, these are all the types of community endeavors that when de Tocqueville, who wrote Democracy in America, came over in the 1830s and sort of looked around like, why is America so exceptional? It was because they formed associations and did things on their own, right? He uses this metaphor of, like, in Europe, if there's a tree in the middle of the road, someone who comes across it's going to cross their arms and wonder why government hasn't removed it first. And in America, folks will get together and get their mules and saws and axes and remove the tree. And that carried on for a long time. I mean, I think what's really interesting, if you look back at the history of the 1918 pandemic, there was a flu pandemic in the United States, and the federal government had a role, but a lot of the things that you see is that America still had in its blood that we built things and did things on our own. I mean, we weren't done in 1918 adding states to the Union yet. But like folks' grandparents still had just carved cities out of the wilderness. And so when it came time to respond to a pandemic, I mean, folks got together, they formed committees and councils, they shared information, they made masks or decided to do mail-in elections or close schools or keep schools open. They got together and worked things through on their own. So if you come to, you want to consume news on the basis of, I want to be informed and participate, I think there's just some places to go. It is a shame local news media has sort of fallen by the wayside. The economics don't really support what used to be maybe one or two papers in every city. The broadcast TV stations are much more regional. It's tough to get good local news. That probably speaks to the need to just know your neighbors better. But just again, back to news consumption. If your desire is to help, be a good active citizen, that's one thing. But I think the temptation going all the way back to the garden when the serpent said to Adam and Eve, eat of this fruit of knowledge and you will know and be like gods, right? I think we have this real deep-seated temptation when we scroll through social media to just know and consume and feel like we need to place judgment on anything rather than like pretty much any other gift of God, which is use it in a good way that advances the kingdom and heralds his glory. Yeah.
Yeah. And when you mentioned de Tocqueville, it's interesting that overwhelmingly he was amazed at our system. But one of his only critiques was a prophetic one. And it was what he called soft despotism, which was he saw a scenario in the future of just a gradual turning to a dependence on government to handle every, A through Z issue. And I wrote about this actually a couple of years ago. It was such a prescient statement that he made, and in a lot of ways, it has come to fruition in our country, and that's unfortunate. But that's a really great resource. That book is amazing, and of course, primary sources are really integral to extracting facts from any type of news outlet. And I just personally, I would avoid it as regards getting the news, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Kevin, editorials and opinion pieces, because they are designed to share opinions. So we couldn't really regard that as news.
It's not news. I mean, depending on the writer, they might have a really interesting perspective. I think one of the maybe useful exercises to do to see if you are being gracious to other image bearers is on an issue that you might disagree with, could you yourself write an essay or an op-ed in support of that other position that you disagree with in a way that is charitable enough that someone who actually believed that would think that that is a good statement of some of the suppositions and arguments and remedies for the issue at play. Because I think if you look at someone who disagrees with you as a traitor to the nation or out to destroy the church or whatever, then there's no room for compromise and moving forward and bearing with them the grace that should be afforded to them. And our constitutional structure does require compromise. And that's not to say the church should join in and call justice what God plainly calls injustice, but it is to recognize that in our way of government, the way we ameliorate differences is not bowing down to a king so that we may be like other nations, but through the political process, dealing with settling our differences that way if the community can't resolve them on their own.
Yeah, that's really good stuff, Kevin, and I appreciate you joining me today. That's all the time we have. Your wealth of knowledge is just excellent, and I enjoyed having you. So thanks for taking the time.
Thank you. It's been an honor. God bless.
This is Kevin Sunday, and this is the For Freedom's Sake video.